The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your heart race. It was one of those moments where you could feel the storm brewing before the first drop of rain fell. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street, but the calm was deceptive. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, breaking the silence, but it wasn't enough to drown out the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and closing in, a group of figures emerged from the shadows, their faces hard, their eyes cold. They moved with a swagger that screamed trouble, and at the center of their attention was a girl. She stood tall, her dark skin glowing under the fading light, her expression unreadable. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that this wasn't just any girl. This was Kaya. And she wasn't about to back down. Kaya had always been different. Growing up in a neighborhood where the odds were stacked against her, she had learned early on that the world wasn't always kind. But instead of letting it break her, she had chosen to fight back. Not with anger, but with strength, discipline, and an unshakable sense of self. Her father, a former Marine, had taught her how to defend herself from a young age. "The world will try to knock you down," he'd say, "but you don't have to let it." Those words had become her mantra, and over the years, she had trained relentlessly, honing her skills until they were as much a part of her as the air she breathed. But tonight, all of that training was about to be put to the test. The gang had been following her for blocks, their taunts growing louder, more aggressive. At first, she had tried to ignore them, hoping they'd lose interest and move on. But they didn't. Instead, they closed in, their words cutting through the air like knives. "You don't belong here," one of them sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Kaya's jaw tightened, but she kept walking, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She knew better than to engage, but every step felt heavier than the last. Her heart pounded in her chest, a steady drumbeat that seemed to echo in her ears. She could feel their eyes on her, their hatred like a physical force pushing against her, but she refused to let it break her. And then, it happened. One of them stepped in front of her, blocking her path. He was taller than the others, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over her. "You think you're tough?" he growled, his voice low and menacing. Kaya didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her body was already shifting, her muscles coiled like springs, ready to react. The others circled around her, their laughter ringing in her ears. But she didn't flinch. She had been here before. Not in this exact moment, but in moments like it. Moments where the world tried to tell her she was less than, that she didn't matter. But she had always proved them wrong. And tonight would be no different. The leader of the gang took a step closer, his breath hot on her face. "You're gonna regret walking down this street," he spat, his words laced with venom. Kaya's eyes narrowed, her gaze steady. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Her senses heightened. Every sound, every movement amplified. She knew what was coming next. They always made the first move, and when they did, she would be ready. But as the seconds ticked by, something shifted. The air seemed to grow heavier, the tension reaching a breaking point. The gang leader raised, his hand, his fingers curling into a fist, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Kaya's mind raced, her training kicking in. She knew what to do, but she also knew the stakes. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something bigger, something she couldn't quite put into words. And as the first blow came hurtling toward her, she made a split-second decision that would change everything. What happened next would leave the gang stunned, their confidence shattered. But for Kaya, it was just the beginning. The fight was far from over, and the real battle was yet to come. As the dust settled and the echoes of the confrontation faded into the night, one thing was clear. They had underestimated her, and that was a mistake they would never make again. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that this was just the first chapter in a story that would shake their world to its core. And Kaya? She was just getting started. The sound of the gang leader's fist cutting through the air was like a gunshot in the stillness of the night. Kaya's body moved instinctively, her training taking over. She sidestepped the blow with a fluid grace, her movements precise and deliberate. The gang leader stumbled forward, caught off guard by her speed. For a split second, there was silence. A collective intake of breath as the others watched, their bravado faltering. Kaya didn't wait for them to recover. She spun, on her heel, her foot connecting with the leader's side in a swift, powerful kick. He crumpled to the ground, his face a mask of shock and pain. The others froze, their confidence wavering as they realized, too late, that they had picked the wrong person to mess with. But Kaya wasn't done. She turned to face the rest of the gang, her eyes blazing with a fire that made them hesitate. "Who's next?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with steel. No one moved. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your stomach churn and your palms sweat. For a moment, it seemed like the standoff might end there, with the gang backing down and slinking away into the night. But then, one of them, a wiry guy with a sneer that didn't quite reach his eyes, stepped forward. "You think you're tough?" He spat, his voice shaking with anger. "You're just a girl. You don't belong here." Kaya's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than words ever could. She had spent her entire life proving people wrong, fighting against the stereotypes and prejudices that tried to define her. And tonight was no different. She took a step forward, her stance firm, her eyes locked on the wiry guy. He hesitated, his bravado cracking under the weight of her gaze. But before he could make a move, the gang leader staggered to his feet, his face twisted with rage. "You're dead," he snarled, his voice trembling with fury. "You hear me? Dead." Kaya didn't flinch. She had heard those words before, from people who thought they could intimidate her, control her, break her. But they didn't know her. They didn't know the hours she had spent training, the sacrifices she had made, the battles she had already fought and won. They didn't know that she had grown up in a world that tried to tell her she was less than, that she didn't belong, that she should be afraid. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. As the gang leader lunged at her again, Kaya braced herself, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't take them all on at once, not without risking serious injury. But she also knew she couldn't back down. Not here, not now. She ducked under his swing, her body moving like a well-oiled machine. She countered with a sharp jab to his ribs, followed by a spinning elbow that sent him reeling. The others hesitated, their confidence wavering as they watched their leader fall again. But Kaya knew better than to let her guard down. She could see the anger in their eyes, the desperation. They weren't going to give up that easily. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A glint of metal, catching the faint light of the street lamp. One of the gang members had pulled out a knife, his hands shaking as he gripped the handle. Kaya's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't panic. She had been trained for this. Her father had always told her that the key to survival was staying calm, thinking clearly, and never letting your opponent see your fear. She took a deep breath, her mind racing as she calculated her next move. The knife changed everything. One wrong step, one moment of hesitation, and it could all be over. But before she could react, a voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. "That's enough!" The gang members froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. Kaya turned, too, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make out the figure approaching from the shadows. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the dim light. But there was something about the way he carried himself, something that made the gang members take a step back, their bravado crumbling. "You don't want to do this," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "Walk away. Now." For a moment, no one moved. The gang leader glared at the man, his face twisted with anger, but there was something in his eyes. A flicker of fear, of doubt. He glanced at Kaya, then back at the man, before finally spitting on the ground. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice low and menacing. He turned to the others, jerking his head toward the shadows. "Let's go." They hesitated, their eyes darting between Kaya and the man, before finally following their leader into the darkness. Kaya watched them go, her heart still pounding in her chest. She turned to the man, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make out his features. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with suspicion. The man didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. And then, finally, he spoke. "Someone who's been watching you," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You've got skills, kid, but you're in over your head." Kaya's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She didn't like the way he was looking at her, like he knew something she didn't. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp. The man hesitated, his eyes scanning the empty street before landing back on her. "I want to help you," he said finally. "But you're going to have to trust me." Kaya's mind raced, her instincts screaming at her to be cautious. She didn't know this man, didn't know what he wanted or why he was here. But there was something about him, something that made her pause. She had always trusted her gut, and right now it was telling her that this man wasn't a threat. At least, not yet. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. The man didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his eyes locked on hers, as if he were weighing his words carefully. And then, finally, he spoke. "Because you're not the only one they're after," he said, his voice low and urgent. "And if you don't listen to me, people are going to get hurt. A lot of people." Kaya's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing as she tried to process his words. What did he mean? She wasn't the only one? Who else were they after? And who was they? The question swirled in her mind, but before she could ask any of them, the man turned and started walking away. "Wait!" she called after him, her voice sharp. But he didn't stop. He just kept walking, his figure disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. Kaya stood there for a moment, her mind reeling. She didn't know what to think, what to feel. All she knew was that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The gang might have backed off for now, but they would be back. And when they came, she needed to be ready. But more than that, she needed answers. Who was that man? What did he know? And why was he so sure that this was bigger than her? As she turned and started walking home, her mind raced with possibilities. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. Whatever was coming, she would face it head on. And she would fight. Because that's who she was. That's who she had always been. And no one, not a gang, not a mysterious stranger, not the world itself, was going to change that. Kaya's footsteps echoed softly against the pavement as she made her way home, her mind still racing from the encounter. The man's words played on a loop in her head. "You're not the only one they're after." Who was they? And why did it feel like she had just stepped into something much bigger than herself? She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the gang lurking in the shadows or the mysterious man reappearing out of nowhere. But the street was empty. The only sound the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. When she finally reached her house, she paused at the door, her hand hovering over the knob. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Always be aware of your surroundings. Kaya. Danger doesn't always announce itself. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before stepping inside. The familiar scent of home. Warmth, spices from dinner, and the faint hint of her father's cologne was a small comfort, but it didn't ease the knot of tension in her chest. Her father was in the living room, his broad frame silhouetted against the soft glow of the TV. He looked up as she entered, his sharp eyes immediately noticing the tension in her posture. "You're late," he said, his voice calm but firm. Kaya hesitated, unsure how much to tell him. Her father had always been her rock, her mentor, but she didn't want to worry him. Not yet. "Got held up," she replied, forcing a casual tone. "Just some guys messing around. Nothing I couldn't handle." Her father studied her for a moment, his gaze piercing, as if he could see right through her. "You sure?" he asked, his voice low. Kaya nodded, but the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. She knew her father could sense there was more to the story, but he didn't press her. Instead, he simply said, "You know where I am if you need me." Kaya nodded again, her throat tight with unspoken words. She wanted to tell him everything. About the gang, about the man who had appeared out of nowhere, about the cryptic warning that had left her feeling more unsettled than the fight itself. But something held her back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the fear of dragging him into something she didn't fully understand yet. Whatever it was, she kept it to herself, retreating to her room to try and make sense of the chaos swirling in her mind. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the pieces of the puzzle refused to come together. Who was the man who had intervened? And why had he seemed so sure that this wasn't just about her? The gang's hatred had been personal, their words dripping with venom, but the man's warning suggested something bigger, something organized. Kaya's stomach churned at the thought. She had always known there were people out there who hated her for no reason other than the color of her skin. But this felt different. This felt calculated. The next morning, Kaya woke up with a sense of unease that refused to fade. She went through her usual routine, training with her father, helping him with chores, trying to act like everything was normal. But her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the man's words, about the way the gang had looked at her, about the knife that had glinted in the dim light. She needed answers, but she didn't know where to start. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when she was walking to the library to study, that she got her first clue. She was passing by an alley when she heard voices, low, urgent, and familiar. She froze, her heart pounding as she recognized the gang leader's voice. "She's not like the others," he was saying, his tone tense. "She's got skills. We need to be careful." Kaya's breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear more. "We don't have a choice," another voice replied, one she didn't recognize. "If she's a threat, she needs to be dealt with. The boss won't tolerate any loose ends." Kaya's blood ran cold. The boss? Who were they talking about? And what did they mean by dealt with? She wanted to stay and listen, to gather more information, but the sound of footsteps approaching made her decision for her. She slipped away, her heart racing, her mind spinning with questions. This wasn't just a random gang looking to intimidate her. This was something bigger, something organized, and she was right in the middle of it. As she walked, her thoughts turned to the man who had intervened the night before. He had known something he hadn't shared. Maybe he was the key to figuring this out. But how could she find him? She didn't even know his name. All she had was his voice, his presence, and the cryptic warning he had left her with. It wasn't much to go on, but it was all she had. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kaya made a decision. She couldn't just sit back and wait for the gang to make their next move. She needed to take control, to find out what was really going on. She grabbed her jacket and headed out the door. her father's voice echoing in her mind. Sometimes, the best defense is a good offense. She didn't know where she was going or what she would find, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let anyone dictate her fate. Not the gang. Not the mysterious man. Not anyone. As she stepped into the night, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her, Kaya couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a storm. But she wasn't afraid. She had been training for this her whole life. And whatever was coming, she would be ready. The only question was, who else was out there, waiting in the shadows? And what did they want with her? The answers were out there, somewhere, and Kaya was determined to find them, no matter what it took. Kaya's footsteps were quick and deliberate as she moved through the dimly lit streets, her senses on high alert. The air felt heavier tonight, charged with an unspoken tension that made every shadow seem alive, every sound a potential threat. She had no clear plan, no destination in mind, just a burning need to uncover the truth. The gang's words from earlier echoed in her mind. The boss won't tolerate any loose ends. Who was this boss? And why had she become a target? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. Some crucial piece of the puzzle that would make everything click into place. As she turned a corner, she noticed a flickering neon sign in the distance. It was a small, rundown diner, the kind of place that stayed open late and didn't ask too many questions. Something about it felt familiar, though she couldn't quite place why. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed through the door, the bell above it jingling softly. The diner was nearly empty, save for a couple of tired-looking patrons and a waitress wiping down the counter. Kaya slid into a booth near the window, her eyes scanning the room. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but her gut told her this was where she needed to be. The waitress approached, her expression neutral. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice flat. Kaya ordered a coffee, more for something to do than because she wanted it. As the waitress walked away, Kaya's eyes landed on a man sitting at the counter. He was older, his face weathered, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug. There was something about him, something that made her think he might know more than he was letting on. She watched him for a moment, debating whether to approach him, when suddenly he turned and met her gaze. His eyes were sharp, piercing, and for a moment, Kaya felt like he could see right through her. Before she could decide what to do, the door to the diner swung open, and a group of men walked in. Kaya's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the gang leader from the other night. He didn't see her at first, his attention focused on the man at the counter. Kaya slid lower in her seat, her pulse racing. What were they doing here? Were they following her? Or was this just a coincidence? She strained to listen as the gang leader approached the older man, his voice low but urgent. "We've got a problem," he said. "She's not backing down, and if she keeps digging, she's going to find out too much." The older man didn't respond right away. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "Then handle it," he said. "You know what's at stake." The gang leader nodded, his jaw tight, before turning and walking out of the diner. Kaya's mind raced. "Handle it." The words sent a chill down her spine. She had to get out of there, had to figure out what was going on before it was too late. But as she stood to leave, the older man turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "This isn't your fight." Kaya froze, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. The man studied her for a moment, then sighed. "You've got guts, kid," he said. "But guts won't save you from what's coming. You're in over your head." Kaya's jaw tightened. "Then tell me what's going on," she said, her voice sharp. "If I'm in danger, I deserve to know why." The man hesitated, his eyes scanning the room before landing back on her. "It's not just about you," he said finally. "There are things at play here. Things you can't even begin to understand. Walk away while you still can." Kaya wanted to argue, to demand answers. But before she could say anything, the sound of sirens cut through the night. The man's expression darkened, and he stood abruptly, tossing a few bills on the counter. "Stay out of this," he said, his voice low and urgent. "If you know what's good for you." And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had appeared. Kaya stood there for a moment, her mind reeling. She didn't know what to do, who to trust, or where to turn. But one thing was clear. She couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. As she stepped out of the diner, the cool night air hit her like a slap. The sirens were closer now, their wailing filling the streets. Kaya's instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, but she forced herself to stay calm. She needed to think, to figure out her next move. But before she could, a hand grabbed her arm, yanking her into the shadows. She spun around, ready to fight, but stopped short when she saw who it was. It was the man from the other night, the one who had intervened with the gang. His face was grim, his eyes filled with urgency. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and tense. "It's not safe." Kaya pulled her arm free, her eyes narrowing. "Then tell me what's going on," she demanded. "Who are you, and why are they after me?" The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's complicated," he said finally. "But if you want to survive, you need to trust me, and you need to come with me. Now." Kaya's mind raced. She didn't know this man, didn't know if she could trust him. But something in his eyes, something desperate, almost pleading, made her pause. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. The man glanced over his shoulder, his expression tense. "Because if you don't," he said, his voice low and urgent, "you're not going to make it through the night." The word sent a chill down Kaya's spine. She didn't know what to do, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't stay here, not with the gang closing in, not with the sirens growing louder, not with the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. She took a deep breath, her mind made up. "Fine," she said, her voice firm. "But if you're lying to me, you're going to regret it." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Follow me," he said, turning and leading her deeper into the shadows. Kaya hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding, before following him. She didn't know where they were going or what she would find when they got there. But one thing was certain. The storm was coming, and when it hit, she would be ready. Whatever it took, she would fight. Because that's who she was. That's who she had always been. And no one, not the gang, not the mysterious man, not the shadows closing in around her, was going to change that. Kaya followed the man through the maze of narrow alleys, her heart pounding with every step. The sirens had faded into the distance, but the tension in the air was thicker than ever. She kept her guard up, her eyes darting to every shadow, every movement. She didn't trust him. Not fully. But she didn't have much of a choice. The gang was out there, and whoever this boss was, they clearly weren't playing around. She needed answers, and right now, this man was her only lead. They finally stopped in front of an old, abandoned warehouse, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. The man pulled out a set of keys and unlocked a side door, gesturing for Kaya to follow him inside. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but she forced herself to step through the door. The inside of the warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of oil. Kaya's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she realized they weren't alone. A small group of people stood in the shadows, their faces tense, their eyes wary. Who are they? Kaya asked, her voice low but firm. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to the group and nodded, as if giving them some kind of signal. One of them stepped forward, a woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense expression. "This is Kaya," the man said, his voice calm but urgent. "She's the one I told you about." The woman studied Kaya for a moment, her gaze piercing. "You've got guts," she said finally. "But guts aren't going to be enough. Not for what's coming." Kaya's jaw tightened. "What's coming?" she asked, her voice sharp. The woman exchanged a glance with the man before speaking. "You've stumbled into something bigger than you realize," she said. "This isn't just about you or that gang. This is about a network, a system that's been in place for years, and you've just become a threat to it." Kaya's mind raced. A network? A system? What were they talking about? "I don't understand," she said, her voice steady but laced with frustration. "What does any of this have to do with me?" The woman hesitated, her expression grim. "It's complicated," she said finally, "but the short version is this. You've been marked. They see you as a liability, someone who could expose them, and they don't take kindly to liabilities." Kaya's stomach churned. She had always known there were people out there who hated her for no reason. But this was something else entirely. "Who's they?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. "And why me?" Before the woman could answer, the sound of a phone ringing cut through the silence. One of the group members answered it, their face paling as they listened. "We've got a problem," they said, their voice tense. "They're coming, and they're not alone." The room erupted into chaos, everyone moving at once, grabbing weapons, checking equipment, shouting orders. Kaya stood frozen, her mind racing. Who was coming, and what did they want? The man who had brought her here grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful. "You need to get out of here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now!" Kaya shook her head, her eyes blazing. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not running, not again. If they're coming for me, I'm going to face them." The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand," he said. "And this isn't just a fight. This is war. And if you stay here, you're going to get caught in the crossfire." Kaya's mind raced. She didn't know what to do. But she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't just walk away. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. "Then tell me what's going on," she demanded, her voice sharp. "If I'm going to fight, I need to know what I'm up against." The man hesitated, his eyes scanning the room before landing back on her. "Fine," he said finally. "But you're not going to like it." He led her to a corner of the warehouse, where a map was spread out on a table, covered in markings and notes. "This is what we're up against," he said, his voice low and tense. "It's not just a gang. It's an entire operation. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking. They've got their hands in everything. And they've got people in high places. Cops, politicians, you name it. If you take them on, you're not just fighting a gang. You're fighting a system." Kaya's stomach churned. She had always known the world was unfair, but this was on a whole other level. "And you?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. "Who are you in all of this?" The man hesitated, his expression grim. "We're the ones trying to stop them," he said finally. "But it's not easy. They've got resources, connections, power, and they'll do whatever it takes to protect it." Before Kaya could respond, the sound of engines roaring outside cut through the silence. The man's face paled. "They're here," he said, his voice tense. "You need to go. Now." Kaya shook her head, her jaw tightening. "I'm not running," she said firmly. Not this time. The man hesitated, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and admiration. Then stay close, he said finally. And whatever you do, don't get caught. The warehouse doors burst open and chaos erupted. Men poured in, armed and dangerous, their faces masked, their eyes cold. Kaya's heart pounded as she braced herself, her training kicking in. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going down without a fight. Whatever it took, she would stand her ground, because that's who she was, that's who she had always been. And no one, not a gang, not a system, not the shadows closing in around her, was going to change that.